The aircraft produced by Imperial Japan are some of the most fascinating to have emerged from the Second World War. Developed by a nation which had rapidly industrialized its military, developing an aircraft industry that was producing designs on par with Western powers, despite coming somewhat late to the party, the designs were as excellent as the politics behind them were incompetent and often self-defeating. Now in that case, I am of course referring to the insane rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, a normal inter-service rivalry could have been a catalyst for healthy competition, resulting in better aircraft being designed for both services, but in Japan this was decidedly not the case. The rivalry between Army and Navy went far beyond regular inter-service competition, and it's a topic far beyond the scope of this video, but in a nutshell, the two branches often operated like rival states within a state, each with its own strategies, foreign policies, intelligence networks, and weapon development programs, and this of course included aircraft. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, also known as the Army Type 1 fighter, and known to the Allies in World War II as the Oscar or as the Army Zero, was the second most produced Japanese aircraft of the war, behind the Zero, and it was one of several excellent aircraft born from this dysfunctional relationship. And, like all of them, it was compromised by it. By December the 7th, 1941, the Hayabusa was as important to the Army as the Zero was to the Navy, though to be fair the Hayabusa wasn't available in such numbers yet. It was a lightweight, sleek, and nimble machine, able to easily outmaneuver any American fighter sent to oppose it. However, that was also about the only good thing it had going for it when it came to facing said American fighters, at least on the face of it. The Hayabusa was fragile, comparatively slow, and it burst into flames if a .50 caliber Browning so much as looked at it. The design was, in several ways, quite outdated when compared to its rivals. And yet, the Ki-43 Hayabusa has established a reputation as one of the most effective Japanese aircraft of the Second World War. It's something of a contradiction, I know, and there's a reason I've avoided talking about a lot of Japanese World War II aircraft, as it tends to start a lot of arguments. Also, there is bugger all photographic record of said aircraft, so if you see the same photo repeated a few times in this video, I do apologise for that. But today I'm going to be brave and I'm going to talk a bit about the development and history of this machine. The good, the bad, and the ridiculous. Now, speaking of history, would you like to know how I was able to trace 2 centuries of missing history from my family tree? Well, that was with the help of MyHeritage, the sponsor of today's video. Now, I'm incredibly fond of MyHeritage, I've used their service before, and I've collaborated with them before on this channel as well. And I was really excited when they offered to send me a free DNA test kit. I've never done a genealogy test before, but I'm hoping it confirms some of the suspicions that we have of Italian heritage on my dad's side of the family, or at least something that explains the brown eyes and olive skin in an otherwise pasty English family tree. The kit itself was dead easy to use. MyHeritage sent it out to me a few weeks ago. Everything you need is in a neat little box along with clear, concise instructions. You do a set of cheek swabs, you pop the sample away, and you post it back to the address printed in the instructions. MyHeritage then sends it to their lab, and a few weeks later you'll receive an email with your results. Included in the results is something called an ethnicity estimate, a percentage breakdown of your origins across 42 supported ethnicities and over 2,000 geographic regions. While my DNA was jet setting its way across the Pacific Ocean to be analysed, I passed the time by using MyHeritage's amazing photo colorization tools, which can also animate your photos as well now, and then a few weeks later my results were in. Alrighty, so the results are in, I've got my email, I've clicked on the link, and am I ready to explore my ethnicity? I think I am, so let's find out what the numbers say. Alright, I am 44% English. Well, that explains the addiction to McVitie's. 15% Scottish and Welsh. 14% French. Excellent. 12.8% Dutch. Now that I am not surprised by, judging from my earlier family tree history. and almost 14% of the rest with Germany and Denmark, which makes plenty of sense. But none of the suspected Italian heritage, though. So 44% English, 15% Scottish and Welsh, 14% French, nearly 13% Dutch, and 14% of the rest, which is a mix of Germanic, the Guernsey, no, not Guernsey, like Brittany, and Denmark. And the other thing we can, of course, see is something that is known as DNA matches on here, which basically connects your family trees with other family trees on MyHeritage with people who have done the DNA test as well, to find relatives you might not otherwise have discovered. Now, it's also important to mention that this system is supported by a massive amount of user data, and this data is secure. MyHeritage has committed in its privacy policy to never sell or license genetic information, which gives users peace of mind. Alright, so in the end, I found out I was linked to 7 different ethnicities, and I was able to add 9 new people onto my family tree, one of which filled in a missing gap on my father's side, which was incredibly useful as I was then able to use that to dig up a lot more stuff going back about 2 centuries, which is no small win in my books. Now, if you want to try this out yourself, I have some excellent news. You can sign up for a 30-day free trial, and MyHeritage has a promotion running right now. Click on the link in the description below or scan the QR code that's been on the screen, and use the coupon code REX to receive a 10% discount when ordering your DNA kit. So thank you MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video, and now let's have a closer look at the history of the Ki-43. The origins of this sleek and lightweight fighter can be traced back to the interwar years, a period during which Japan's imperial ambitions were expanding with increasing confidence and a certain lack of subtlety. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which officially began in the summer of 1937, was less a sudden escalation than the natural continuation of tensions brewing since the delicately named Manchurian incident of 1931, a false flag event started by Japan to justify its invasion and occupation of the region. During this period, Japanese air power advanced rapidly, but not under the same selection pressures that were faced by European nations. The opposition, primarily Chinese forces, was flying an eclectic mix of often outdated machines, including interwar biplanes like the Curtiss Hawk III. Now, in such an environment, even modest advances in speed or maneuverability were more than enough to achieve superiority. And it was in this context that the Nakajima Ki-43 entered service in 1937. Now, I did a video on this aircraft in the early years of the channel, but in a broad nutshell, it was a nimble and lightweight fighter with a fixed landing gear. Though it did have an enclosed cockpit, most pilots chose to fly with it open in favour of better visibility, and sometimes they removed the sliding canopy door altogether. But it was already approaching obsolescence by Western standards when it entered service. In Europe, where air forces were accelerating towards all-metal monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and a retractable landing gear, the Ki-43 might have been retired before it ever took flight. In East Asia, however, it reigned supreme, at least for the time being. But this all soon led to a problem. As the world stumbled towards a global conflict, Japan's Army Air Force found itself in the increasingly awkward position of fielding frontline aircraft that, by Western standards, were already obsolete. Recognizing this, the Air Ministry chose expedience over competition. Rather than opening the floor to multiple manufacturers, officials went directly to Nakajima, the manufacturer responsible for the Ki-43. Rather hilariously, Nakajima had its main rival, Mitsubishi, to thank for this. In the previous Army fighter competition, Nakajima had emerged as the sole winner, securing a production contract for the Ki-43. Kawasaki and Mitsubishi, on the other hand, were left with little more than expensive prototypes and had to absorb steep financial costs. In response, both firms began lobbying the Japanese government for a reform on the military procurement process. The goal was to eliminate open competitions, thereby reducing the financial risk associated with speculative prototype development. Now, the government ultimately agreed, and new procurement guidelines were issued, mandating that future fighter development would be handled by a single designated manufacturer, rather than through a competitive process. But for the Army, this single manufacturer was not going to be Mitsubishi or Kawasaki. Given Nakajima's successful delivery of the Ki-27 and its proven track record with the Army, it was the natural choice to receive the contract for its replacement, what would eventually become the Ki-43. Their task was straightforward in theory. Replace the Ki-27 and at the same time produce an interceptor and bomber escort capable of defending Japan's modern bombing fleet, which, though technologically advanced, had revealed an unfortunate tendency to be shot down over the skies of China. The requirements were quite ambitious: a top speed of 500 km per hour, a climb rate of 1,000 meters per minute, and an operational range of 800 kilometers. Now, these were all demanding but not outlandish. That is until one reached the final requirement. The new aircraft must be at least as maneuverable as the preceding Ki-27. This last demand was, in engineering terms, a headache. In practical terms, it bordered on the delusional. The Ki-27 had been built with agility as its defining trait, trading armor and firepower for almost ethereal handling. Trying to match that nimbleness in a faster, heavier, more powerful fighter was like, well, I could summarize it in a dozen different metaphors, but it's all one. The idea was practically impossible. But such was Japan's doctrinal obsession with maneuverability, a fixation rooted in tradition, reinforced by early successes in China, and only slightly tempered by emerging European ideas about speed and firepower. The result was a set of requirements that pulled in opposite directions, and yet Nakajima, with either confidence or a sense of duty, accepted this challenge. Hideo Itokawa, a lead designer at Nakajima, and later known for higher ambitions involving rockets, was appointed chief designer of the Ki-43 project. The design took shape throughout 1938 in record time, with the final drawings being presented in December 1938, and the finished first prototype ready to take flight in early January 1939. The initial design challenge was, of course, to achieve the impossible, matching the Ki-27's acrobatic agility in a larger, heavier aircraft. The design team began with a perfectly logical, if ultimately impractical, approach. If the new aircraft was to weigh 50% more than its predecessor, then surely the wing area should increase by the same proportion. Predictably, this only added more weight, more drag, and detracted from speed. It was eventually conceded, quite sensibly if somewhat reluctantly, that some form of compromise would be necessary. The solution was a more modest 20% increase in wing area, enough to enhance maneuverability without entirely sacrificing performance. As a result, later in its service life, the Ki-43 would, predictably, not have any problems with maneuverability, easily outclassing virtually all enemy designs in a turn fight. Durability, however, would be another matter. In the pursuit of ever tighter turning circles, armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were totally omitted. The design team had clung to a weight-to-power limit of 2.15 kilograms per horsepower, as if it were a sacred figure, an emphasis that, with the benefit of hindsight, might be best described as optimistic. The end result design was a sleek, low-wing monoplane of all-metal construction held together with hopes and dreams, and it included modern features such as a retractable undercarriage and a fully enclosed cockpit. The initial design featured the in-house built 14-cylinder Nakajima HA25, producing 980 horsepower at takeoff power, although this would increase substantially in later variants. The resemblance to its forebearer, the Ki-27, was markedly evident, a family resemblance which would harm it during its first run of test flights. The second and third prototypes, because the Japanese liked to build multiple, joined the first at Nakajima's testing facilities at Ojima Airfield, where military test pilots from Akano Aviation School were able to fly the Army's new fighter for the first time. Very quickly, the Army's reviews came rolling in, and they were as scathing as they were, in hindsight, ridiculous. To begin with, pilots accustomed to the incredible maneuverability of the Ki-27 complained that the Ki-43 was sluggish and heavy in comparison. The enclosed cockpit, with its smaller canopy door, was also heavily criticised. Pilots fighting in China would routinely stick their head out of the Ki-27's larger sliding canopy to get a better view. So why was it done away with on the Ki-43? And perhaps most hilariously, the aircraft having a retractable landing gear was criticised. Pilots said that it complicated the airframe, added weight, and didn't meaningfully add to maneuverability, so why bother adding it in the first place? Looking back, it's clear that Nakajima had done wonders with a conflicting set of requirements and a mentality that was hopelessly outdated. However, the reviews of the pilots were an important bridge to cross if Nakajima were to have a hope of getting their design into series production. And getting a contract for that, with all the testers being utterly hostile, would be incredibly difficult. Despite this setback, Nakajima were very confident in their new fighter, and were happy to put the negativity down to a lack of forward thinking. As such, with no guarantee at all that the army would pursue the type, they continued with development, thinking that the Ki-43 was ultimately such a good design, it would win over army officials in the end if given a fair try. At great financial risk, they built 10 more aircraft, which sort of served as a prototyping/pre-production series. These were built between November 1939 and September 1940. These aircraft introduced several changes, many of which were done to appease the test pilots. This included a redesigned canopy, an elongated fuselage with a slimmer cross-section, an improved radio, improved cockpit layout, and a myriad of other small changes to the internal structure. Now, from this batch, there were a couple of standout examples. Two would be armed with a pair of HO-103 Type 1 12.7mm machine guns, whilst two others would receive the new HA-105 engine, featuring a boosted power output of 1100 horsepower and a two-stage supercharger. But perhaps the most significant change in the redesigned Ki-43 in general was the addition of the so-called butterfly combat flap. This Fowler-type flap could be deployed to increase lift, dramatically tightening the aircraft's turning radius. The results were indeed encouraging. The aircraft could now perform loops and Immelman turns at speeds as low as 270 km per hour. Stall recovery was prompt, and acceleration from low airspeeds proved excellent. Now, what the testing failed to reveal, however, was that Nakajima's tireless efforts to lighten the wing structure had come with an unfortunate side effect. It had also weakened it. Under the strain of high-G combat maneuvers and dives, the wings proved distressingly prone to structural failure. Unfortunately, it was a flaw that would not make itself known until much later, and often at the most inconvenient of times. However, that was a future problem. For now, Nakajima's persistence was being rewarded. By the time the 10th prototype rolled off the line in late 1940, Army officials finally, and somewhat reluctantly in some cases, admitted that the Ki-43 was a suitable replacement for the Ki-27. On January the 9th, 1941, the order was finally given for Nakajima to begin full-scale production of the Ki-43, and it was christened Hayabusa, meaning Falcon in Japanese. A suitable title for a machine that had spent most of its development life fighting for recognition. The initial production model would be the Ki-43-1, which was the first of three major production variants. Just short of 9 meters in length, 10.8 in span, and less than 2 tons empty, the Ki-43-1 represented an exceptionally light and modern fighter. Its most conspicuous shortcoming, however, lay in its armament. This was a simple arrangement of two cowling-mounted machine guns, typically drawn from a modest selection, the 7.7mm Type 89 and the 12.7mm Type 1. Now, any combination of the two was considered acceptable by the Japanese army, which was as hilarious as it was foolish. By 1941 standards, two machine guns did not a heavy armament make. For comparison, the Americans and the British were fitting between 4 and 8 on their frontline fighters. Just look at the Hawker Hurricane, for goodness sake. The version of the Ki-43 with two 12.7s would be passable, but unfortunately the majority of the early production Hayabusas were instead fitted with dual 7.7mm guns, an arrangement that could be relied upon to trouble only the most fragile of opponents. Against larger or more heavily built aircraft, the firepower was more a suggestion rather than an effective means of attack. Alas, this was something that was recognised far too late, and as an aside, this is a somewhat recurring theme when it came to late interwar and early World War II Imperial Japanese aircraft armament. By April 1941, the Ki-43s were rolling out of factories and getting sent to flight schools, where pilots were gradually converted to the type. The first aircraft reached combat units by autumn, and by the time the attack on Pearl Harbor took place, 40 had been taken into service, with about a dozen more still being worked up. In China, the aircraft debuted as a complete surprise to enemy forces, and it represented an enormous leap forward from the Ki-27, which was already a tough aircraft to contend with for the Chinese. In the Pacific, by December 1941, the Ki-43s were not present in large numbers. Just 56 of them were divided between the 59th and 64th Sentais of the Army Air Force, so they didn't have much of a part to play in the opening operations. It was during the Malayan campaign that the Hayabusa was first given a proper chance to stretch its wings and meet its contemporaries in equal combat. The British, who had been somewhat caught with their pants down, had only the Brewster F-2A Buffalo on hand, a machine with the unfortunate distinction of being outmatched in nearly every respect in this theatre. The result was swift and predictable. The Ki-43 ran circles around its poor opponents, prompting an urgent transfer of Hawker Hurricanes to the theatre in a bid to restore some semblance of balance. The Hurricanes proved a more respectable match. Interestingly, Japanese pilots believed that they were fighting Spitfires, whilst their British counterparts assumed they were fighting the legendary Zero. A confusion that, while flattering to all parties involved, didn't change the outcome. In general, the Japanese came out on top. Throughout the campaign, the 59th and 64th Sentais claimed 43 fighters and 18 bombers shot down, for the loss of just 16 Ki-43s. It was an impressive showing, but already this success was coming at a cost. The Hayabusa's excellent performance in flight was being counterbalanced by some troubling vulnerabilities, and some were direct consequences of its lightweight design philosophy. Structural compromises made in the pursuit of extreme maneuverability left the aircraft's wings distressingly prone to failure under high G-loads. In steep dives, for example, there was a very real risk that the wings might simply part company with the rest of the airframe. Indeed, this happened multiple times at training schools, to the general distress of training officers and trainee pilots alike, and necessitated a hasty reinforcement of the wing structure that only partially solved this issue. As a result, its rated dive speed was considerably lower than that of its contemporaries, and this was something that did not go unnoticed by enemy pilots, who quickly learned that diving away was a reliable method of escape. Equally troubling was the aircraft's armament, as already mentioned. As combat experience mounted, it became increasingly obvious that its two machine guns, particularly the 7.7mm variants, had the combat potency of a drunk pigeon. The F-2A Buffalo and the Hawker Hurricane could both endure a surprising number of hits from these weapons, whereas the lightweight Hayabusa, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks and any meaningful armour, had a rather more theatrical response, often being reduced to a fireball by a single well-placed burst from either aircraft's .303 caliber machine guns. The telescopic gun sight was also heavily criticised, being wholly unsuitable for use in high-speed turn fights, with pilots having to eyeball their shots without a suitable crosshair. But beneath these design compromises lay a far deeper problem. The bitter and hostile rivalry between Army and Navy forced each service to run its own aircraft factories, tooling facilities, and supply chains. Nakajima's Ota plant churned out Hayabusas for the Army, while Mitsubishi's Nagoya complex turned out Zeros for the Navy, and despite the enormous pressures of the war, neither could share airframes, parts, engines, or assembly jigs. Considering Japan already didn't have a hope in hell of matching the industrial output of the United States, this wholesale duplication was a fatal squandering of scarce skilled labour, machine tools, and not to mention factory floor space. And this denied Japanese squadrons the economies of scale that were being enjoyed by Allied manufacturers. And it wasn't just the factories that were split either, so were the supply lines, and in fact this was often the greater problem of the two. Separate ordnance plants, storage depots, and supply convoys were required for each branch, and even routine spares like spark plugs, hydraulic lines, tyre valves were branch-specific. This also applied to ammunition. The Hayabusa initially carried 7.7 by 58mm Type 89 rounds, while most Navy aircraft used the 7.7 by 56 SR Type 97. These were ammunition types that could not be interchanged in the field. Dimensionally and ballistically, they were incompatible. Pilots and ground crews alike would later recount raids where half-empty ammunition drums were abandoned rather than having them risk contaminating with mixed belts. Fuel and oil too also ran down bifurcated pipelines, with each service jealously guarding its own designs for self-sealing fuel tanks and lubricant grades. The result was two identical yet completely incompatible supply lines that limited combat readiness and would magnify the vulnerabilities of the Hayabusa and to a certain extent the Mitsubishi Zero as well. Given the Ki-43's apparent fragility and impotency and the logistical nightmare throttling it, the excellent performance of the type in its combat debut against modern fighters is perhaps one of the most striking examples of skilled hands in compromised airframes. Many Japanese pilots were battle-hardened veterans from the skies above China, and yes, there probably was a bit of overclaiming when it came to recording confirmed kills, but that's something you see throughout the entirety of the war, on both sides. Regardless, the Ki-43 had been received warmly, but its drawbacks had been highlighted sharply. However, development had already begun on a new version to remedy some of these issues, and this was the Ki-43-2. 5-1s were held back to function as prototypes for the new variant. They received an uprated engine with a 2-speed supercharger, designated the HA-115. This produced over 1150 horsepower and drove a new 3-blade propeller. More importantly still, the type featured a new wing design. This new design was not only structurally stronger, crucial given the wing-shedding habits of the earlier variant, but also 30 centimeters shorter and capable of mounting bomb racks, expanding the aircraft's tactical flexibility for the army. Considerations were also made for the pilots, a somewhat rare event in Japanese aviation for the time, owing to the Hayabusa's incredible proclivity to catch fire and/or explode. Along with armour being provided on the pilot's seat, the fuel tanks were coated in rubber to form a primitive self-sealing fuel tank. It wasn't as good as ones being introduced on Allied aircraft, such as the Grumman F4F Wildcat, but it was better than nothing. The armament was also slightly improved. This time, the two 12.7mm guns were kept as standard, improving the firepower to a bare minimum, although by early 1942 this was still way less than ideal. In fact, the design not accommodating more significant firepower from the outset would be an issue that would plague the Ki-43 throughout the rest of its service life. Options like installing additional gun pods under the wings would significantly reduce performance and were not usually considered. There was one other change, and one which cannot be overstated, and that was the removal of the archaic telescopic gun sight in favour of the reflector sight. This would have a bigger impact on combat performance than the modest increase in firepower ever could hope to achieve. The first of these new aircraft would leave the factory floor in February 1942, taking their first flights not long after. Surprisingly though, it would take another 7 months for them to actually enter service in relatively strong numbers in the autumn of that year. Meanwhile, the early Ki-43s continued to fight on, even though they were already getting quite long in the tooth. After the Japanese victory in the Malaysian campaign, the 64th Sentai was relocated to Burma to continue the fight with the British. It was here that one of the more sobering illustrations of the Ki-43's early vulnerabilities unfolded. 5 Ki-43s were scrambled to intercept a raid of RAF Bristol Blenheims, heading to bomb their airfield. During their initial passes, the leader of the flight, Captain Takeo Kato, was raked by return fire from the twin 7.7mm guns of the Blenheim's dorsal turret. At least one bullet hit its mark, and Kato's Ki-43 erupted into flames, plunging into the ground with the pilots still aboard. Whilst having certain strengths against other fighter aircraft, its impotent armament and incredible vulnerability made the Ki-43 particularly ill-suited to dealing with larger aircraft, even one so lightly defended as the Bristol Blenheim, a type which was now considered easy pickings for the Germans in the European theatre. However, the Ki-43 was only going to be called into the interceptor role more and more as the war went on, and against much more well-defended aircraft than the old Blenheims. By the Battle of Midway, not only had the Japanese lost the upper hand, but what had been a war against the Americans mainly characterized by carrier operations and naval fighters, handled by the Zeros, would increasingly transform to one where the Imperial Japanese Army would play a larger part, as US forces began the land-hopping campaign to get to the Japanese home islands. By late 1942, the heyday of even the Zero had already reached its zenith. Allied pilots knew not to get caught up in a dogfight, and instead to employ boom and zoom tactics, engaging on their own terms, and exploiting the Japanese aircraft's reliance on superior maneuverability over speed. The Ki-43, cut from much the same cloth as the A6M0, found itself subject to these same tactics, and exposed by the same vulnerabilities. Like its naval cousin, the Hayabusa relied heavily on superior maneuverability to win engagements, and unfortunately for its pilots, that advantage was increasingly rendered moot when opponents refused to play along. In fact, in Burma, the Ki-43s had faced exactly this at the hands of the Flying Tigers, an American volunteer group flying Curtiss P-40s. A group that ultimately ended up destroying almost 300 enemy aircraft to the loss of just 14 pilots, a figure that, even allowing for a measure of wartime accounting optimism, was more than enough to cause alarm. Further trouble then came in mid-November 1942, when Allied forces had the fortune to recover 4 abandoned Ki-43s that had been damaged on the ground. An intelligence report based on these examples confirmed what frontline pilots had already begun to suspect. The aircraft was pitifully underarmed. Not only this, but the same report indicated that almost all of the 12.7mm machine gun's ammunition was of the high explosive type, meaning that it had almost no penetrating power, and far less HE punch than would be seen on a cannon. The Allies quickly found out that the Ki-43 was undergunned and incredibly vulnerable, and although the Ki-43-2 made some attempt to remedy this problem, it was taking far too long to get into service. It wasn't until January 1943 that the Ki-43-2 finally began reaching frontline squadrons in meaningful numbers. By this point, panic had well and truly begun to set in, and production was expanded beyond Nakajima, with Tachikawa being brought on board in a bid to accelerate factory output. Aside from the aforementioned changes, the only other major change with the Ki-43-2 was a slight increase in diving speed, going from 600 to 650 km per hour. It still wouldn't be outdiving much, but it wouldn't be as much of an exploitable weakness as on the Ki-43-1. As the war turned from bad to worse for Japan, a detachment of Ki-43s were sent to the Kuril Islands in an attempt to create a base of operations for intercepting raids from American heavy bombers flying in from Alaska. It's unknown exactly how effective this was. They did shoot down at least 2 B-24s in mid-1943, but they were later transferred to the Philippines in order to combat US forces there, where they were all but destroyed. As types like the P-51 and P-47 became more and more common, and Japan's sphere of influence shrank, the Ki-43 became more and more relevant, but also more and more vulnerable. It could not match the speed of the new American fighters joining the theatre, and had little chance of striking back with its poor armament, unless the Allied pilots would be foolhardy enough to engage in a turn fight, which admittedly was something that occasionally happened, but not frequently. The 64th Sentai, withdrawn from Burma and also given orders to focus on intercepting enemy bombers, found itself supporting the Imperial Japanese Army during the ill-fated attempt to invade India and destroy the Allied forces there. During this operation, one of the pilots of the 64th Sentai, Shotaro Konishi, would encounter a B-29 Superfortress, marking the first time an army fighter had done so. Unsurprisingly, he was not able to shoot it down, owing to the Ki-43's remarkably impotent armament compared to this flying behemoth, but he did live to tell the tale, which was something of an achievement considering the defensive armament of the B-29. Shortly thereafter, the 64th Sentai would be converted into operating the Ki-43-3, an attempted modernization of the aircraft that would install a 1320 horsepower engine with water methanol injection. 10 pre-production aircraft of this type would be produced from May 1944 to May 1945, and it doesn't appear to have entered service. The aircraft at this point held very little appeal for the Nakajima design team, as work had shifted onto the Ki-84, and so they shifted responsibility of the Ki-43 over to Tachikawa. Left to make the best of a platform that had long since passed its prime, Tachikawa's engineers continued working. In a bid to address the Hayabusa's chronic lack of firepower, they managed to equip it with a pair of 20mm Hull 5 cannons. It was a long overdue upgrade. Unfortunately, space constraint meant that each gun could only carry 60 rounds of ammunition, meaning that pilots, to be effective, had to use incredible trigger discipline. Considering at this point most of the experienced pilots of both the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were dead, this was not a good combination. Mercifully, putting a cannon-armed fighter into the hands of rookie pilots with only 120 rounds of ammunition in total never occurred in this case. This variant, designated the Ki-43-3 Utsu, never progressed beyond 2 prototypes before the war came to an end. In hindsight, it is difficult to see these final developments as anything other than an exercise in diminishing returns. With the Ki-84 already entering service by mid-1944, offering superior speed, firepower, and survivability, the continued refinement of the Ki-43 was perhaps a sentimental and desperate waste of resources. As the war drew to a close, the older Ki-43s, along with many other outdated Japanese aircraft, would be repurposed for kamikaze duties, although many would be kept back for the final defense of the home islands. By the time the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and attacked the Kuril Islands, just 4 Hayabusas, along with 4 B-5N torpedo bombers, remained to fight them off. These 8 aircraft clashed with Soviet fighters on August the 18th, and although no victories were claimed by either side, this was the last stand of the Hayabusa in Japanese hands. With 3,190 produced by Nakajima and 2,629 produced by Tachikawa, the Ki-43 was the second most produced Japanese fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Post-war, the Hayabusa's career was short-lived, with some minor service seen by the French in Indochina, the Indonesian Air Force, and the Chinese. For all of its structural shortcomings, and its pitiful firepower, and all the other things I've ragged on it during this video, the Nakajima Ki-43 proved itself to be far more than the sum of its parts. Though pilots would later refer to it as fragile and underarmed, and not without reason, the aircraft consistently delivered impressive combat results in the hands of experienced aviators. In theaters ranging from China to Burma and the Pacific Islands, the Hayabusa became a reliable and often formidable tool for the Japanese Army Air Force. Its success lay largely in its handling.
Thanks to its Fowler flaps, it could turn inside almost any contemporary Allied fighter, a trait that, when exploited properly, made it a deadly opponent in close quarters combat. Against less experienced adversaries, or those unwise enough to be drawn into a turn fight, the Ki-43 remained lethal well into the war. But only when it was in the hands of experienced pilots. And that was the crux of the matter. Japan ran out of experienced pilots very quickly as the war progressed in the Pacific. Its combat record reflects this. In the early stages of the war, particularly in Burma and Malaya, Ki-43 pilots racked up victories against a range of Allied aircraft. Even the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, equipped with the P-40 Warhawk and trained in energy tactics, acknowledged the skill and aggression of Japanese pilots flying the Ki-43. In these engagements, the aircraft's agility and responsiveness often gave it the edge, allowing it to recover quickly from stalls, evade return fire with ease, and capitalize on brief openings. Countless aces racked up their numbers in the Ki-43, none more than Sergeant Satoshi Anabuki, with 39 confirmed victories. Anabuki was comparatively lucky. He survived the war. Many other Japanese pilots did not. And as the first wave of experienced aviators faded away, for want of a coarser expression, the new and untrained pilots that took their place were not able to exploit the Ki-43's advantages, but they brought out all of its worst traits. A few examples of this remarkably flawed but nimble machine still survive today, including a well-preserved Ki-43-2, which is currently on display at the Pima Air and Space Museum. Though it began life under unnecessarily harsh scrutiny, the Hayabusa well and truly earned its fame, and today it's remembered as one of the most maneuverable and often flammable combat aircraft of the Asian and Pacific theatre.
Once again, thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget to try the 30-day free trial and use the code REX to get 10% off your DNA kit purchase.
As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. Now, it's been a little while since I've done a deep dive video, I think, about 2 months, and yes, I know this one isn't even an hour long, but when it comes to Japanese aircraft, reliable sources and photos are hard to come by, so you get what you're given. And for those who enjoyed this, there will be some more Japanese aircraft coming in the future. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters, and a warm welcome to Edward Perkis and Asa Tolentino, who are the newest members of this special group. The next series of video votes are up on Patreon, so be sure to go and vote for your preferred aircraft or topic to get planning priority for the future. And work is continuing on the History of Curtis video series. I know there has been a bit of a hiatus. I delayed part 2 because I wasn't happy with the script and the pacing, but things are now back on track, so expect to see that later on this month. But as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.